Just like the demand curve, the supply curve can shift around. Underlying determinants of supply can change so that sellers become more willing to sell at a given price or less willing to sell at a given price. And that gets reflected on our graph by shifting the supply curve around. Okay, now, when supply decreases in a market, that is represented by an upward and leftward shift in the supply curve. So let's take our original supply curve here, S. We'll draw a new supply curve. In this case, we'll make a parallel. Call that new supply curve S prime. This represents a decrease in supply, which might sound a little bit odd to think about because the supply curve is going up. So how could that be a decrease in supply? Well, keep in mind that when something is, if there's less supply available, that means one of two things, or actually it means both of two things. One thing that it means is for a given quantity of units, you would have to offer a higher price to get sellers to be willing to sell them when the supply is scarce, when there's a decrease in supply. And the other thing that a decrease in supply could mean is that at a given price, you couldn't buy as many units as you used to be able to. All right, and you can see both of those at work here. Take a given quantity of units, right? Call that quantity QS, and notice that on the original supply curve, you could have gotten that many units from the sellers at a price, call it P1. Whereas at the on this new decreased supply curve, you would have to pay a higher price, P2. And by the same token, if you hold the price fixed, now we'll call that, relabel this QS prime. At a price P2, you could get only QS prime units when your supply curve is up here, but at the original supply curve, you could have gotten QS units. All right, so shifting the supply curve up and to the left represents a decrease in supply. And so that must mean that an increase in supply is represented by shifting this supply curve down and to the right. So if that's our original supply curve, we could draw a new one below and to the right of the first, call it S prime. And now notice that if we hold the quantity of units supplied constant, at QS, at that original price, we would have had to pay this higher price P1. But now that the supply curve has shifted down and to the right, that increase in supply means you can get the same amount of the good for less money, a lower price, P2. All right. And if you look at this second price, P2, and you look at the quantity of units that you could purchase given the original supply curve S and the new supply curve S prime, I'll relabel this QS prime now. Notice that on the original supply curve, at that price P2, you could only get this many units. On the new supply curve, that same price, you could purchase more units for it. All right, so that downward, rightward shift of the supply curve represents an increase in supply. And so in this next and final video, we're going to talk about what are the determinants of supply? What are the things that can happen that shift this curve up and down?